Basic anatomical terminology. We'll go over body positions, directional terms, planes, and sections, as well as the body cavities. So for body positions, we'll start with the anatomical position. When a person stands erect, facing whomever is observing them, the upper extremities will be down at their sides. The palms of the hands will be facing forward, so they'll be facing the observer. And then the feet will be flat on the floor, as we said the person is standing erect. And that is the anatomical position. When a person is in this position, they're facing you, so you are looking at their anterior or their front side. So ante meaning before. And then behind them, their backside would be posterior. So those are the directional terms. If a person reclines, or when they recline, if they lie face down, they're in the prone position. And then if they lie face up, that would be the supine position. So supine position, you can kind of think spine. Their spine is what is down or in contact with the surface. We also have some regional names here. The cephalic area for the head, the cervical area for the neck. And then we have your trunk with the thoracic, abdominal, and the pelvic regions. And then we have the upper limb and the lower limb to note. Next, our directional terms. We have our midline that we'll be using to start with this point of reference, and that will be medial. And then on either side of that is lateral. And this will help these directional terms. We like to use these so we can precisely locate one part of the body relative to another, and then reduce the length of the explanations. So you'll always want to make sure that you are giving it relative to another body part. So you can't just say that the shoulder is proximal. The shoulder is proximal to the hand because the shoulder is actually distal to the head. So you have to make sure that you are giving those body parts. Well, proximal and distal are better used for nearest and furthest, and then above and below for superior and inferior. So in that example, it would actually be better to say that the shoulder is inferior to the head, but then for proximal and distal, then you are going to say that the shoulder would be proximal to the elbow versus and distal from the hand. And then here we have many more directional terms also included. You'll see ipsilateral, contralateral, so same side of the body or opposite side of the body. And then we get into our planes and our sections. The planes will be imaginary flat surfaces that are used to divide the body or the organs into definite areas. And then these main planes that we have will be the mid-sagittal, or the going down the midline, parasagittal, and this parasagittal, it's going to be slightly off of the midline. So here, this is the mid-sagittal. It's cutting directly through the center of the body, whereas parasagittal is just next to or nearby. So it's not directly on the midline, but it is still a sagittal cut. Then we also have frontal cuts. Coronal cuts, those are going to go through the head, and then we have transverse or a cross section, and then finally the oblique cut, which is at an angle. Sections are going to be flat surfaces that result from cutting through the body. They are named according to the plane on which the cut is made in. So transverse, frontal, and mid-sagittal here you'll see. Now the body cavities. These are going to pick back up, or you'll see these again in the next chapter when we begin talking more about the tissues that line these body cavities. But we have our cranial cavity and our vertebral cavity. That's going to be formed by the cranial bones in the skull, and it will contain the brain. And the vertebral or the spinal canal is going to be formed by the bones of your vertebral column, and it will contain the spinal cord. There will be the meninges that are protective layers that will line these cavities. So when we talk about the nervous system, we'll talk about these meninges, but their purpose is to serve as layers of protective tissue, and there are 3 of them. And then we have the body cavities of the trunk. So here we have our thoracic cavity, and in the thoracic cavity we have the pleural cavity, the pericardial cavity, and the mediastinum. The pleural cavity encloses the lungs, while your pericardial cavity surrounds the heart. And then the mediastinum is more of a broad median partition that goes between the lungs and then extends from the sternum to the vertebral column. And it contains all of the contents that make up your thoracic cavity except for the lungs. So it sits in the middle, or the medial area, so it does not contain the lungs as they sit around it. And then the abdominal pelvic cavity, we have the abdominal cavity, and then we have the pelvic cavity. In the abdominal cavity, you'll find your stomach, spleen, pancreas, liver, gallbladder, small intestines, and then most of your large intestines as well. And then in the pelvic cavity, you'll find the urinary bladder, a portion of the large intestine, and internal female and male reproductive structures. So in the thoracic and abdominal cavities, those membranes have a thin, slippery serous membrane. That serous membrane will cover the viscera, or the actual organs that are in the cavity, and they'll also line the walls of the thorax and the abdomen. So here, the layer of this membrane that actually lines or comes into contact with the viscera or the organs is called the visceral layer. And the layer that comes into contact with the wall of the thorax and the abdomen is the parietal layer. In between those 2 layers, there's going to be a little bit of fluid, the serous fluid, and that's just so that we can reduce the friction and allow the viscera to slide somewhat during movements more comfortably. The serous membrane will include pleura, pericardium, and peritoneum. So in the pleural membrane that surrounds the lungs, you'll have visceral pleura that will actually touch the surface of the lungs, and then the parietal pleura that lines the chest wall. And in there you'll have a little fluid. And then next you have the serous membrane of the pericardial cavity, which we refer to as the pericardium. Same visceral surface covering the actual heart, and parietal lining the chest wall with a little pericardial fluid in there as well. And then finally the peritoneum, that's going to be in the abdominal cavity, and same layer. So parietal will cover the abdominal wall, and the visceral will cover all of the organs in your abdomen. So now this goes through and shows you each of the cavities we've talked about, as well as gives you how they're formed, some of the organs that you'll find in there as well. Same thing here, just showing you actually now this visceral and parietal layer, and then where you see the space in between, that's going to be where the fluid is. We can take our abdominal pelvic region and we can divide it into either regions or quadrants. So this helps us to describe the location of organs more easily. And so when we divide it into regions, it ends up being 9 regions with 4. We draw the 4 imaginary lines. So it's like a little tic-tac-toe board, and that gives you your regions. And then if we divide it into quadrants, we just pass 2 lines through, and we like to pass this these lines through the umbilicus. So that will conclude our lecture here for chapter 1. You'll want to make sure that you do go through, know these body positions, be able to recognize them, know the quadrants as well, and the regions, know what organs will be in those regions, in those quadrants. This is particularly important. So think about if you were to do a surgery and cut through, you would know what organs you might potentially hit. And then, of course, knowing the cavities and the membranes.